The German Marshall Fund into our discussion today that is titled The Democratic Potential of the New Russian Emigrants. My name is Joerg Forbrig. At the German Marshall Fund, I oversee our civil society programs in Central and Eastern Europe, and I have the pleasure of chairing this discussion today. Now, our topic today is probably as delicate as it is important. Delicate because many of you may ask themselves the question why it is that in a situation where Russia leads a brutal war against Ukraine, we shouldn't be focusing all our attention on Ukraine, on assisting the country, on hopefully ending this war as quickly as possible. This is the question that we're also asking ourselves at the German Marshall Fund. At the same time, we're quite confident that we're doing a lot to support Ukraine. We have stood up an emergency program for civil society and independent media over the last year. We're quite actively involved in helping Ukrainians wherever we can to build up further resilience to this brutal war that Russia has unleashed against their country. And we're also already involved in international strategizing on recovery plans for Ukraine once this war ends, hopefully soon. So for that reason, we believe that we can also pay some attention on our end to the other side of this war, which is obviously Russia, Russian society, and Russian politics. And we have brought together this round today because we feel that it is important to also look at all those who have left the country, especially over the last year, to look at societal dynamics. Because obviously we're also all asking ourselves as to where Russia will go next in this war, and especially also after this war. This war, after all, has also been a sea change for Russian politics and society, and I think the question is pertinent to also look at that side of the unfortunate equation. For this reason, GMF is currently looking more systematically, especially also at those who have left Russia over the last year. We would like to understand a little better what the dynamics are in that very large group of Russians who have left in response to the war against Ukraine. And we have been very fortunate to find Dr. Oxana Schmies, who has written a paper for us. I will share the link in a minute. This paper has just been published, and it looks at the democratic potential of recent emigrants from Russia. We would like to explore with her and with two speakers in this round what's in there, what kind of momentum may be in that group, who are people that left recently, where have they landed, how do they engage, if they engage. Oxana is a Berlin-based analyst. She holds a PhD from the Max Weber Colleague at the University of Erfurt. She has been involved with academia, Humboldt University here in Berlin, but also with a variety of think tanks, including the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies and the Center for European Policy Analysis. Oxana's paper, as I mentioned, has just been published. Oxana, congratulations on the paper. Thank you for the work you have put into it, and many thanks for joining us here. We're looking forward to the discussion with you. Now, to discuss Oxana's paper, we have two excellent speakers. Natalia Arno is founder and president of the Free Russia Foundation, one of the certainly foremost institutions of the democratic Russian diaspora. Prior to that, she served as country director for Russia at the International Republican Institute, and also as a linguistics professor at the Modern Humanitarian University in Moscow. Welcome, Natalia. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And third, we have Matthew Rojansky, who is president and CEO of the US-Russia Foundation, which is a legacy institution of the US-Russian Investment Fund. And it makes grants to initiatives aimed at media and free enterprise, the rule of law, civil society, and broadly also expertise on Russia. Matt has previously served as director of the Kennan Institute, one of the foremost US institutions to study Russia. And he's also held positions at the Carnegie Endowment, the Partnership for a Secure America, and the US Embassy in Kiev, Ukraine. Matt, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining. Now, before we finally start, a few technical matters. First, we will record the session to make it available on the GMF YouTube channel for those who couldn't join us today. In the order, we will hear Oxana first with principal findings from her research. We will then follow with comments from Natalia and Matt. And finally, we will then open for questions and answers. And for that, I would ask you to use the chat function or the Q&A function. You can do so already in the course of the presentations, of course, and then when we come to the discussion itself, I will pose those questions to our three speakers. With this, let me end this brief introduction and hand it over to Oksana for her presentation of the main findings of her research. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joerg, and thank you. I would like first to thank German Marshall Fund for this wonderful opportunity to address this issue, and especially its Berlin office. So I have prepared a couple of slides to summarize my findings, and I would like to share them with you. So I would start. Since its full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has experienced and is experiencing probably the largest wave of immigration in its history. Several 100,000 to over 1 million people have left the country. However, the phenomenon of a mass immigration from Russia of the last 22 years of the years of Putin's rule is not a new phenomenon. As we see on this slide, the immigration has first rose sharply in the year 2012 after the fraudulent parliamentary elections of 2011, and also after Putin's announcement he would return to the presidency. It also rose after the annexation of Crimea. After the annexation of Crimea in the year 2014 and 2015, and stayed at an upward trend before falling in the year 2021. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 gave a huge boost to immigration. The Institute for Demography in Moscow has recorded in the first half of the year 2022 that migration for the first time since 1975 has exceeded the natural attrition and has accounted for more than 20% of the population loss. At the moment, it is still too early to have fully comprehensive data on the numbers of those who left the country, because the most exact data can be obtained from the countries of destination, and it is a long process. The data that we have at the moment are the data of the Russian Federal Statistics Service, Rosstat, but they have to be scrutinized and be dealt with caution, because most probably they understate the scope of the phenomenon. Also because Rosstat registers the immigrants on different criteria than international organization or international migration authorities do. So most probably the Rosstat data are lower than the data we will obtain later. However, we know that the scope is already remarkable and the immigration goes on. We know also what were the main countries of the first destination. shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, we have to take into account that the passenger air traffic between Russia and Western countries was suspended, first due to coronavirus restrictions, and then because of sanctions imposed on Russia because of invasion. That is why the most people went to the countries that could be easily accessed by air and were visa-free. Armenia, Georgia, and Turkey were the countries with the most numbers of leavers shortly after February. Also Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, so Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, as well as less popular countries for Russians to immigrate to, such as Mongolia, were countries where dozens to hundreds of thousands of Russians immigrated. Serbia, Israel saw also large numbers of entrants. Also, other destinations that I have not listed on this slide who offered visa-free stay for Russians included the United Arab Emirates or some countries of Central and South America. After the announcement of mobilization, many left by road. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia were the most popular countries for those who left by road. To the United States that stated its readiness to accept Russians after the announcement of mobilization in September of 2022, the European Union has restricted its visa and entry requirements for Russians. That is why the European countries have not been the major destinations. Nevertheless, many left by land borders, and from the EU countries, the highest numbers of Russians were, the countries that accepted the highest numbers of Russians were Estonia, Finland, and Lithuania. Overall, we know that the Russian immigrants are spread now in 47 countries of the world. Those who left between February and the announcement of mobilization in September 2022 had a very clear profile. They were predominantly young, with the average age of approximately 32 years. They had a high educational status, were predominantly not married, were well off, dynamic. That means that they could undergo a radical change of environment and still be professionally active or politically active. This flow is characterized by a large share of IT specialists. They comprised up to 1/3 or even a half of the whole flow. Also representatives of Russian civil society, journalists, activists, cultural workers, those who were associated with the last remaining liberal media, such as TV Дождь or Echo Moskvy, that were closed soon after the invasion, also built a part of this flow. After the mobilization announcement in September 2022, the immigration consisted immediately after the mobilization. The immigration consisted mainly of men in conscription age. On this slide, I have listed probably the main motives for those who emigrated, that are risk of criminal prosecution for previous political activity. Many of the immigrants have been politically active for many years in Russia. Risk of being conscripted to the army, unwillingness to be associated with the aggressor state or become its accomplice. Clearly stated opposition to the regime, prohibition of professional activities, or departure of the employer, and growing instability. As one study put it, the political and economical reasons for leaving are often very closely entangled. Since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, different initiatives of immigrants have emerged. Also those which provided a voice from above for the oppositional forces outside Russia and consolidated their efforts. I have listed some of the initiatives that I characterize as top-down initiatives on the left side, that are Russian Anti-War Committee, Russian Action Committee, as well as Secretariat of European Russia that is to be built in Brussels, and one convent, Congress of Free Russia. But also the so-called average immigrants, as I call them, have created groups and carried out activities that can be crucial for the development of a broad democratic movement. First, they founded groups of mutual aid. Then these groups were transforming into communities of people who meet regularly. Now we have a landscape of comprising hundreds of different civic projects. Majority of them has a clear anti-war and pro-Ukrainian agenda. These communities are developing their efforts to combine. There are efforts to combine them with a political agenda of a democratic transformation and to attract those who have not been politically active yet. So among the most important bottom-up initiatives is also would be important to name organization that was launched to help those who left Russia immediately after invasion of Ukraine. It is Kovcheg, or the ARC. There are also several media or news outlets that have been founded by journalists. The horizontal connections the immigrants have started to build could be a means to develop further and unite democratic efforts of Russians abroad. There are also two congresses that I list here on the right side: Congress of Russian Civil Communities and Anti-War Initiatives Congress, that are important developments in this respect. I'm sorry, going back to this slide, I would like to only to add one point that seems very important for me. Speaking about top-down and bottom-up initiatives, it would be important to bear in mind that all the efforts to build an official representation for the Russians abroad, for the oppositional Russians, should not impact the efforts of the ordinary or average Russians to develop a common vision and to consolidate themselves. So having studied the initiatives that emerge and having made first approach to grasp the phenomenon, I would like to propose the following areas for support. First of all, I think, and as I propose, that better legal mechanisms that differentiate between Russian government and Russia's people are needed on the EU level. What we have now is characterized by restrictions, mass restrictions concerning the entry requirements and stay requirements for the Russian immigrants. The prevailing policy line is here security concern, but it is not a real solution, neither for entry nor for residence and work of those dozens of thousands who are in the EU and who will enter the EU. So I propose also that solution for residence and work permit in the EU should be elaborated. That could probably be done together with prominent oppositional Russian figures that are also in exile and that have started their first approaches to solve this difficult issue. Further, I suggest that targeted areas such as IT and media could be a good goal to provide particularly quickly and effective support. The main goals would be there to increase the reach of independent reporting inside and outside of Russia. Exactly these categories of immigrants, journalists, and IT specialists are those who are potentially capable to reach out to millions of people inside and outside of country. Besides, these people could work on solutions that connect the immigrant communities and people inside Russia. And finally, the most important goal of support should be building of a broad basis for a real and sustainable democratic change in Russia. This can be reached also by consolidating the democratic initiatives of immigrants and by building of communities and their voices. As Joerg has mentioned at the beginning, the whole issue of the democratic potential of the Russians is probably now is not a very popular topic. It is understandable in the conditions in which Russia is instigating a war of aggression. But every step in direction of Russia of the future should base on rethinking of Russia's past and present now, which is the present of Russia now is present of a country of an imperial aggressor. That is why every support that is directed towards reconsidering of Russia's past and future in a broader mass of population is an aim that could only guarantee a real and sustainable change in Russia. And the Russian Russian immigrants that have shown, due to their first started democratic civic projects, are a good aim, and all their efforts should be supported in this direction. I also think that it is now a very timely task to support the prospective projects of immigrants, because 1 year has passed after the invasion. Many people need to assurance that they are being heard by those whose values they share. Besides, there are really new developments in the landscape of immigrants, and it would be very important to pick them up and build up. That are, as I mentioned at the beginnings of consolidating the communities with a political aim of a democratic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oxana. We certainly heard this very passionate appeal that you gave us at the end. But more importantly, many thanks for this overview. There's plenty more detail in your paper, so I certainly encourage everybody to take a closer look beyond this brief presentation that Oxana just gave us. Now, one of the pieces that you mentioned in here is that there are already forms of activism, of engagement that have come out of this recent wave of Russian emigres. And this is certainly an area that I think, Natalia, you also have insight. You have been engaged within the democratic Russian diaspora for many years, and you are certainly looking very closely at those dynamics, at those initiatives. So perhaps with your brief comments, you could also give us all a look at those more recent forms of engagement as they have emerged. Over to you, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Joerg, and thank you to GMF for organizing this timely, important, and as you said, delicate conversation. My kudos to Oxana for this report. It's very important to track all this and monitor it and analyze it. Though the situation is very fluid, it's changing as we speak. All these people, especially those who are in exile in third countries and transit locations and less safer locations, they again are trying to get to more safer places. Their visas are expiring or legal stay is expiring now, because right now it's exactly 1 year since the full-scale invasion and since this biggest exodus from Putin's Russia is happening. But first of all, what is important is that for us, for democracy Russians, and of course for anybody who understands the situation very well, what has happened on last year on February 24th is the worst possible scenario, the biggest ever tragedy. It's completely terrible, tragic for Ukraine and Ukrainians, but it's also very tragic and catastrophic for Russia and Russians. And of course, all the priority should be assisting Ukraine and Ukrainian people in this fight, not just with Putin's Russia, but it's basically they are on the front lines of the fighting for democracy against this brutal dictatorship. We, for democracy Russians, we don't divide ourselves in those who are in country or in exile. We are a global pro-democracy Russian movement. Yes, unfortunately, many of us had to flee our home country. It wasn't our desire. For years and years, we tried to change the situation inside the country. We were the first victims of Putin's regime. We were the first ones who were warning the international community about the danger of Putin's regime, about the criminal, corrupt, and murderous nature of this regime. We were exposing all these crimes, we were monitoring them, tracking them. Russian activists and journalists, and they are the very first ones who were showing all these corrupt schemes or factory of trolls or direct military engagement to eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea and so on and so forth. And later, all those reports were picked up by Western media and think tank community and so on. But at the same time, we are agents of change. We are those who will be rebuilding Russia from scratch and from disgrace and ashes. And I understand the skepticism of many people about this perspective. Of course, there are a lot of negative scenarios of development. But at the same time, we, pro-democracy Russians, we just cannot afford to be skeptical. We have to have this vision of a free and democratic peaceful and normal Russia, boring Russia, inside focused Russia, and just go strive for this to implement it in reality. On all these internal repressions that are happening in Russia and external aggressions, they are two sides of the same coin. And while to stop the war is a huge priority, just simple ceasefire is not a guarantee for stability in Ukraine. Only Russia as a democracy is a guarantee of of Ukraine's victory to be sustainable. Only democracy in Russia is a guarantee for stability in the region and in the entire world. So it's an important mission for us. It's not easy right now to be a Russian. It's very hard. It's very embarrassing, and of course it's at the same time a huge historic responsibility on us to change the situation. And we are committed to do that with the help of the democratic world. It will be easier and more effective for us. But again, in any way, we will just be doing that because we are believing in that. We cannot just give up. There are a lot of people. We see how resistance is still happening inside the country. It's absolutely wrong to say that Russians are not protesting. There are no massive protests like it was in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, but protests are happening almost every day. According to VDN4, there were like less than 3 weeks when no protest inside Russia was detained for anti-war activity. It's very underreported because of exodus of all independent media from the country. Very often we learn about such protests only from human rights lawyers who start defending these protesters. We see a lot of activity on the ground. We see a lot of new initiatives, grassroots initiatives. Many people are using both advanced tools and methods. For example, my organization, we created factory valves. We have a Stratcom activity and many other advanced initiatives, but at the same time there are a lot of old school initiatives like print out internet, because of so many websites are being blocked in Russia. There is a lot of censorship. Despite Russia is now like second country in the world on installing VPNs, still a lot of population doesn't have access to truthful information, and many activists just print out internet data and put it in the mailboxes, like some is that vector, some is that. And those who are in exile, they are also quite active. Of course, it's a very stateless and homeless community at the moment. More welcome in some countries, less welcome in other countries, but with a huge commitment to still contribute to stopping the war faster, to trying to change public opinion inside Russia. There would be all this independent media that are in exile now, or other new initiatives would be much more effective if there was no self-imposed sanctions by big tech, not allowing to target broader audiences inside the country. So people are active. I wouldn't give up on Russia. The isolation of Russia or ignoring Russia is not a solution. Only democratization of Russia is a response to everything. This is what we are trying to do. We at Free Russia Foundation. It's very difficult to say if we are a top down or bottom up. I created the organization in 2014 from my kitchen table from scratch. I was one of the first exilees. I'm the part of this exiled community. I had to flee Russia in 2012. Otherwise I would be in jail for state treason. And then the organization started to grow. We were in those places where the most relevant for exiled community. We contributed a lot to immigration because we were relocating a lot of people, saving them, thousands and thousands, bringing them to Ukraine first, and to Georgia, and to EU, to many other countries. Of course, after the full-scale invasion, we were evacuating a lot of Ukrainians, simultaneously evacuating Russian activists and journalists. We are now building resource centers in many countries, trying to stabilize this community, trying to make them effective, because what they can do best is, again, they know, they understand Russia and Russian people better, they can have the trust of those people better, and they can explain better. So it's very important not just to save all this community, not just to stabilize them, but to make them stronger. This million of people who are in exile now, they are the best, the most active, the most talented, the most well-educated. They are a huge resource for everybody. Not only that they need help, they can also be very helpful for any host countries, because again, they have the expertise, they have the experience, they know Russia better than anybody can explain it. A huge source of information, and also just again, agents of change, those who are very committed. We have been very silent over the year about what we are doing, because a lot of Russians are helping Ukrainians, but in a discreet way. Again, we were evacuating people just to save people, not to PR, not to tell about that. Now we see that it's important this year to also not only to do things, but also to explain, to tell the story what we are doing. Russians started to protest more in all these EU countries. At first they thought it's brave to protest inside Russia, but why to protest outside? Now they understand, yes, just to be visible. Very often we're joining Ukrainian Israelis without any flags. Again, we cannot associate now with this current state flag, and this new flag of protest movement is again only now picking up its strength. So a lot of work for us to do, but at the same time a lot of commitment from our part, and we have to do a lot of advocacy. That's why this Brussels Secretariat, as Oksana mentioned, it's again, I cannot say it's top down, it's mostly the natural development of our organization, because at first we were there where we were needed in those countries where the most emigration was going from Russia. But now we have to explain again, we have strong teams on the ground in many countries, in Baltic countries, in Georgia, in Germany, and still Free Russia Foundation still has an office in Ukraine, which is quite an achievement for the organization with the name Russia, or to conduct press conference in Kiev in June of 2022, it's quite an achievement as well. But we do need to explain that again, the world needs pro-democracy Russians, and it's very important group that is capable and willing to try to change the situation in Russia for the better. I'll probably stop here, but the only last thing I would say is for us, pro-democracy Russians, the biggest battlefield will be for the values of the Russian society, which won't be easy and won't happen overnight. And we have to start right away, have to prepare, again, believing that this transition period is possible, preparing for the reforms right now. Since we are in many countries of the democratic world, we need to take all this experience from democratic countries of how they became democratic, especially in Eastern Europe, for example, in Baltic countries. And also history teaches us that, all dictatorships are mortal and not forever. And diaspora plays a very important role in many transformation, democratization in many countries, in the Baltic countries, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. Diaspora, people from diaspora were coming back to their home countries as presidents, parliamentarians, reformers, those who were, again, committed to change their home countries for the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. You certainly confirmed some of the principal sort of findings also from Oksana's paper, that there is considerable potential in this community of recent immigrants from Russia. The question, of course, and you would be equally sort of well qualified to speak to that. Is the question how that can be nurtured. I mean, what can be done also from the outside beyond some of the areas that Oksana listed in her presentation and in her paper? What are sort of suitable ways of supporting this community, nurturing its democratic potential, building up perhaps also the sort of cores of activism. And this is sort of the principal question I also want to ask Matt, because you work for an institution that supports such forms of participation, citizenship, civic activism in many ways, and you certainly have a good sense of what at this stage can be done, what exists by institutions like yours as well as others, but also what's needed. Where are there gaps? I mean, we heard some about the entry and stay sort of dimension of Russian immigration, but there certainly is more. So I would very much ask you to sort of give us a sense, especially of this aspect of how to nurture this potential that there clearly is in the observation of both Oxana and Natalia. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Joerg, for hosting this event, and Oxana for producing, I think, a very, very helpful summary in one single place of a picture which is constantly changing and is also made up of many different pieces. I've described when journalists or colleagues in the government ask me about the state of what I've been calling the Russian exiles, to sort of distinguish from migrants or emigrants or emigres, all these terms that we've had for 100 years. You know, I talk about like apples, oranges, and bananas in terms of the source of data, right? Because we have, as you said, we have these kind of official migration data, incoming, outgoing, they very seldom match each other. Then we have data about communities that are living in countries. It's very hard to know within those communities who is new, who is not new, who has arrived because they were going to go anyway, no matter what, because they have a grandmother, whatever, and who has come specifically because of the war, because of the dictatorship, and will go home as soon as they possibly can. And then you have this sort of third category of just, you know, Facebook groups where you can try to locate certain numbers based on, you know, the way they manifest themselves as a network and so forth. So it's very helpful to at least have some authoritative data that you can point to. You mentioned a couple of other groups that are doing important work on that, like Kovchug, and we're trying to follow all of them that we can. And of course, Natasha, I mean, we're so incredibly fortunate to have your creative and energetic and seemingly tireless leadership in this space. It's just incredible. So I think, you know, to deal responsibly with a question like how to support this community, you have to understand what this community is. And I think that both Oxana and Natasha have done a phenomenal job of giving you a feel for the community. I am cautious both about anecdotes and about big numbers, because I think you can often get misled in ways that, you know, may or may not be helpful to the goals of this conversation. For example, we may overstate the commitment of the individuals by telling the stories of, you know, people who are very committed activists. And people may presume when they hear big numbers that there are 500,000 committed Russian democracy activists now living in Europe. That would probably be an overstatement, right? We know that there are many hundreds of thousands of people, and we know there are some very compelling anecdotes. And so I think the right posture to take is to recognize that we probably are going to have more unknowns than knowns about this group of people that we're dealing with until, in a sense, we're looking backwards in the rearview mirror about what has happened. The problem when you're acting on behalf of a government or you're acting as a private funder, I think it was Jeff Bezos who said, if you want to surf the wave, you have to be in front of the wave. So we have to make decisions about where to prioritize resources without knowing in the end what kind of a diaspora community, what kind of an exile community this will end up being. In that sense, I'm careful about these metaphors, but in that sense, it's not dramatically different than 100 years ago when people didn't know. They were in the middle of the emigration in response to the Bolshevik coup and revolution, they didn't know exactly what the role of these emigres would be. Sometimes it must have felt very dynamic and very exciting and very much like anytime tomorrow, perhaps they could go back and they could change Russia. And other times, probably it felt more the way it looks now in the rearview mirror, which is somewhat quaint and detached from reality and ultimately, as we know, kind of a tragic story. I do think it nonetheless makes sense to think of this group of exiles as a particular group and as a single group, right? I think Natasha has illustrated quite eloquently the ways in which these people are connected. The support that we give for initiatives to keep them connected right now, I think is very well justified. When we talk about the other broader set of goals that we might reasonably aspire to, it certainly begins with, you know, an end to this war in which Ukraine is successful and Putin has not succeeded. And in part, that's because everything else becomes easier. Whatever else you want to achieve, whether it's a better future in Russia, whether it's more stability and security for people in Europe, for Ukrainians, for Europeans, for Russians who are living in Europe, even without, you know, a change in a final sort of change to democracy in Russia, all of these things become easier. You know, Natasha has, again, I think very sensitively and eloquently expressed the difficulty of being a Russian exile in Europe at war, right? In a Europe which is bleeding from a war of Russian aggression. So Ukraine has to win this war, and that's in part why I think a lot of the donor community has just reoriented massively towards everything that can be done to support Ukraine in winning and surviving, and then, of course, rebuilding in the wake of this war. All of those things will make the problem sets that we deal with in other areas easier, though it will not solve them. And that's where I think we have to look to triage the problems that we can solve with respect to Russian democracy activists and the broader Russian exile community. We can't see each problem as zero sum. In other words, if we invest, you know, $1 in supporting Russian democracy activism, then we have weakened the cause of Ukrainian victory by $1, right? That I think is one of the problematic debates. That's real. I want to acknowledge that there are people who feel pretty strongly about that. But ultimately, if we take that approach, we'll probably miss an opportunity to move forward on both of these priorities at the same time. Let me give you an example of a way in which I feel that that's linked. I mean, Natasha made a great point about the visibility of Russians. I think that's important because I think when you're making an argument that you're trying to appeal to the world as a whole, including Russians, but other people in the former Soviet region, people in the global South, China, et cetera, you know, seeing that there are actual Russians who identify as Russians, who say that this war is wrong, and that it's a criminal act of aggression, I think is very important. But I think it goes much deeper than that. If Russian society, whether it's in exile or at home in Russia itself eventually, doesn't have the capacity to develop rule of law institutions, then there will be no accountability for what has happened, for this war, and for the crimes that have been committed in this war. That cannot be left entirely to the international community or to Europe or to the United States. And the lessons for that, I feel like, I mean, this is a GMF platform, right? The lessons for that come directly from the experience of the 20th century. You have to build that capacity at home. And I think the investments that we're supporting today, you mentioned, Joerg, the kinds of areas that we fund in. Look, I'll disappoint anybody who's listening and expecting me to get into great detail about what we fund and why and so forth. That's not going to happen. But you know, these investments, I think, are critical to having the capacity to bring about meaningful justice, reconciliation, accountability, which is necessary for democracy in Russia. You can't build democracy on a foundation of non-accountability for crimes. Let me conclude with some realism, some hard questions that I don't have an answer to. What happens if we, broadly speaking, are not successful at ending this war and ending it in a way in which Ukraine survives as a healthy and sovereign state that can reconstruct itself? What if the war just goes on and continues to cost lives and resources for a very, very long time? I don't have a good answer to that. And the reason it's a kind of a realist problem, is that we recognize that there are going to be other problems that are going to mount at the same time. One example that you see in American politics right now is what is looking like at least a mini banking crisis mixed with an inflation crisis on the eve of a presidential election cycle. And those things are going to cause very serious challenges for sustaining the level of support, attention, and resources that we need for these problems. So I don't have a good answer to that. The other problem I don't have a good answer to is what happens if the next phase, the immediate next phase within Russia, is much, much greater repression, right? I don't want to suggest that what's happening in Russia now is good or acceptable, but there are many ways in which it does not represent the maximum of repression that the Putin system or some future post-Putin system could impose, including, for example, our heavy reliance on the internet in order to reach Russian people inside of Russia. One of the big nightmares that I have, there are certain technical solutions. Again, I don't want to get into great detail, but one of my nightmares is that the internet is essentially firewalled off completely, that it becomes a pure kind of North Korea isolation situation. And many people say, no, that's not possible. Here are all the reasons why it's not possible, et cetera, et cetera. I would say if you study Russian history, never say never. There are a number of very scary scenarios that could occur. And then obviously just, massive Stalinist type repression within the country itself. Finally, I'll say something about stakeholdership, and then I promise I actually will end. USRF, as you mentioned, Joerg, started as an investment fund. And the theory of that was that in the wake of Bolshevik communism in Russia and in other former Soviet countries, that you needed to have meaningful private sector stakeholdership, particularly small and medium enterprises where people built things. They had a sense of ownership in them. They felt the freedom to then spend the money that they earned supporting civil society, and that those were critical building blocks for democracy. You couldn't just come in and do political party trainings and hold elections and expect that democracy would take root. And we still believe that. That is still core to our mission. So one of the goals that we have, I would say, medium term, in engaging with the Russian exile community, is that community is also going to have to work, is going to have to be productive, adding value to the societies where they are now living. But what we want to see is that in microcosm, that productivity and that free enterprise that we see among creative, energetic, incredibly well-educated, I mean, this is like the elite of the elite intellectually of Russia, that they in turn are supporting civil society. This is not a donor-dependent community where kind of Westerners are doing charity and the community itself is focused, as we have seen previous waves of emigres, focused on bettering their own economic situation and saying, well, I left that country because it's so broken and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's delicate. I understand just saying that as a Western donor, may be somewhat inflammatory, but we have to put it out there. We need stakeholdership from within the community itself, especially when you talk about 1 million people. They need to be playing a role. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nat. That was great. And I would like to come back to that very last point, sort of on middle class and their sort of investedness in all of this. We've heard 3 sort of very different, excellent perspectives on Oxana's paper and the issue that it captures. We already have a couple of questions. I want to go straight into those, and I will also encourage everybody to add more questions to that question and answer function that we have here. There's a set of questions from Tony van der Tocht. Tony, good to see you on this call. I will probably assign them to our speakers sort of individually. I mean, there's a first question that is about the links between emigre communities and Russians in Russia. We've touched upon this in the conversation already, but I think it's worth sort of drilling down a little more, especially also in light of what both Natalia and Matt have said, that sort of communication lines can also be broken, in many ways are being broken, not just technically, but also by pressure and repression on the inside of the country. So Perhaps to Oksana, the question, how can these links, to the extent that they exist, be sustained, be supported, perhaps also being used for a sort of more positive influence on Russian society from those who reside outside? Do you have any thoughts on that, Oksana?
Thank you. So, yes, if I see it correctly, it is the question concerning the links to people inside Russia. Yes, that is first, it is characteristic for this emigration that they do have good links to the people inside, to their relatives or the close ones or friends who stayed in the country in comparison to the immigrants of the earlier waves. What was at least that is the common characterization of political scientists of the previous waves, that they had much less connection to Russians inside Russia. Mainly that links are digital ones. So, I mean, the people have communicate due to digital channels, due to Telegram and all the messages we do know here. So, of course, they have to use now VPNs largely. And it is, I think it is a very good sphere that could be also connected, also supported, because as I mentioned, the large share of the IT specialists could probably, that are in this immigration wave, they could probably work out the solutions that would be more secure. Because there's the links that are at the moment that are the usual technical links. If we speak really about some sensitive information that should be exchanged, then probably better channels should also emerge. And from a technical point of view, it is possible to do that. So I don't want to go much into detail into IT details, that because also not being an IT specialist, but I think it could be a very interesting sphere to invest, and there could be projects that have a very concise aim, that are timely scaled, and that could be a possible aim of support. So it would be my a bit IT focused answer to this question.
Thanks a lot, Oksana. Maybe over to Nat, because I mean, this obviously is a question also for how we perhaps as institutions who work also with Russian civil society, diasporas, how we could support some of this. I mean, again, this is obviously the tricky territory of detail that can be difficult to talk about openly, but have you seen interesting sort of approaches to building out those links or consolidating those links, supporting linkages between society in Russia and those who find themselves in the diaspora? Can we be hopeful there on that front?
Yeah, we can always be hopeful. I try to remain hopeful no matter what. And, you know, by the way, mostly that comes from personal, like, in the post-pandemic age, it's wonderful that we can do these Zoom panels, but I'm much more optimistic when I meet with people who are fighting this fight in person. It just does wonders for my sense of hope and optimism about what can be done. Even if we're all wrong, at least we're all together. I think, you know, one good rule of thumb, well, let me start with the problem here. It might sound to people like I'm scaremongering or overstating this, but, you know, I'm looking at right in front of me at this article now about a young woman in Russia this week who is being prosecuted for posts on social media. Please understand, this is the tip of the iceberg. This can get so much worse, where people, I mean, remember that with, you know, 1/1000th of the technology, the Soviet Union maintained an absolutely repressive, you know, constantly listening, constantly monitoring police state system. You know, imagine with the level of, you know, technological surveillance that is available now to this regime, if they decided, and perhaps when they decide, to impose that level of control and repression. Sure, there will be a flip side. People will react. People will not be happy, and it may pose a challenge for them. But this is a regime that seldom shies away from that kind of challenge, the challenge of imposing repression. So this could get much worse. And if that happens, the idea of maintaining contacts with people in the West is going to be one of the first things that falls off. It's going to be one of the first things that people say, well, I mean, I don't need this. I don't need this in order to eat. I don't need this in order for my family to be safe. So I'm going to stop. Whether it's kind of passive, like listening to media, or it's active, you know, communicating through social media and even with relatives. Okay, that's the kind of bad news. I think the positive is that people want to connect with each other, and people want to seek out truth, and a lot of that happens organically. So what that means for, you know, Western policymakers, and to some extent for the Western donor community, is do no harm. Don't do anything that makes that harder. There are ways, I not only wouldn't want to talk about it, but I don't know enough to explain. There are technological ways that we can maintain security while all being on the same technological standards to make it maximally easy for people to be connected to each other. There are things that can be done smartly in that way. But there's also just a kind of physical access issue, which is Western governments and Western private actors, you know, banks and major institutions, I think motivated in part by a desire to support the calls from the pro-democracy and anti-war community, have really imposed a lot of constraints that apply to all Russians. But I also want to say something kind of perhaps uncomfortable, which is a big part of it has just been protecting themselves. The easiest way to protect yourself is to impose hardships on all people who could potentially be Russians. And one of the ironies is that I have actually seen non-Russians be caught up in these constraints, making travel more difficult for them, making financial transfers more difficult, establishing legal entities, which would then enable them to support activities, et cetera. I won't get into too much detail, but the bottom line is we have to stop making this harder for people who are our friends. Again, I'm not saying we create special rights and privileges, but let's at least recognize, as Natasha has said, you know, the Russians who are voting with their feet, choosing to be on the right side of history, on the right side of these issues, you know, are certainly no worse than everyone else in the world. So let's not make, you know, their lives additionally more difficult. And then I have great confidence that they will find ways to communicate and remain connected. That I think will happen organically.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I mean, I will certainly flag also that one of the groups that got caught up in a lot of that on several levels that you also mentioned are Belarusians, for instance. I mean, some of you may know that GMF has a sort of long-standing or dedicated program also for Belarusians, and that's where we've seen this up close, the fallout. From that experience, we also know one more thing about connectivity. It's not only about the connectivity between societies inside a given country and their diaspora outside, but it's obviously also about the connectivity within and among diaspora groups on the outside. Because if they want to create some form of sort of more concerted action or programming they will exactly also need those in-person meetings to build confidence and joint activities. So one of the easiest things one would think is sort of mobility programs also amongst them, simple things like travel grants, but even that seems to be very rare. There's a third question, and that's the one that I want to give to Natalia, a third question coming from Tony, and that's about the prospects for consolidation and unification of the Russian opposition, or broadly also diaspora abroad. What's your sense there? What are the prospects for that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Joerg and Tony, for this question. If I may, I will take several questions because I have to leave earlier for another event. What is important to say is that everybody is now trying to find some fast solution, some silver bullet to solve the situation. There is unfortunately not a fast solution. It's very complicated. It's difficult. We all will have to be very consistent and patient, but very determined and consistent in all this. What is very important again, that Russians are, since we always felt ourselves as a part of democratic world, so that the democratic world judges us on the basis of our values and on the basis of our actions, and not on the basis of our ethnicity or citizenship. It's really very important. This public messaging is really important. You cannot even imagine how, because if everybody is saying nothing is possible in Russia, there is no motivation to do anything, and it's very important for us to be motivated, to be very, very determined. So this is like a very huge ask to anybody who is listening to us from EU and US, and it's important. The second thing I want to say is, if I only looked at polls or any I don't know, some only think tank discussions, maybe I would be very pessimistic about Russia's future. But since we work a lot with people, with real concrete initiatives in exile and inside the country, still inside the country, I see a lot of opportunity, a lot of hope for optimism. There is still two Russias, basically. Russia, and it's not territory, it's not where we are inside or in exile. It's mostly how we consume information through internet or through television. And those who consume information through television, they don't differ much if they're inside Russia, and let's say in Baltic countries or in the US, wherever, if they're on the one side of history. Those who are, again, on the right side of the history, they understand everything and they needed to be supported. I understand the concerns of Matt about all this technical and everything else, but we can always go back to old school methods. Still some is that, short waves, whatever, it's still possible. The more important question is, this is the huge, not only military warfare, but also huge psychological warfare. And the Kremlin is very, very skillful in managing all the manipulating all this. 1,000 years ago and now, and thousands years later, people will still have the same fears, doubts, greed, envy, everything else, and they know how to exploit all this. And so understanding this, I think we can do much better job of working with inside the country. When they're saying you're aggressor, you're bad, of course it will be like, well, it's propaganda. If you're saying, but look around, this is your life getting better and all that, then maybe there is already can be a step in the right direction. Repressions are very possible, more, it's already military dictatorship, huge censorship, propaganda, it's all can be more, but at the same time it shows that this is a weakness of the system as well. So I of course fear of more repressions and more censorship, but I understand that the more pressure, the more pushback as well. On opposition and on links, those civil society groups and media outlets that have links inside the country, they feel themselves more motivated, stronger and all that. Most of them are saving all these links. Still a lot of projects appeared. While there is a huge genocide in Ukraine, there is a simultaneous ethnocide inside Russia, and a lot of these ethnic minority groups appeared, a lot of grassroots initiatives appeared. They all have their, they're all together, they are working. We are saying that we are in exile, we are voice for the voiceless, we can be more visible, we can help those who are inside, and again, it's very important to save this connection. On opposition, it's already a lot of consolidation. I know that the West is demanding from us like to be one organization. It's impossible. We all have our differences, but we can be a coalition already. Like I'm in Brussels now, but I was 2 days ago. I was in Paris. We met with the PACE leadership. We were all from the Intervo Committee, Anti-Corruption Foundation, and Free Russia Foundation. We were all together, the same table, talking about all this perspective. We have maybe different methods, and but we still have the same vision. We are not different on the issue of how to, again, what should be done on that. Again, Russia should be a democracy and all that. So it's already much more important is that it's absolutely good coordination among and consolidation and coalition among grassroots actions. There is I don't know, 14 organizations, Stratcom initiative in Georgia, for example, or there are a lot of, like, again, all these links between countries and with inside Russia. So it's a lot of consolidation on this level, at least. I also see very quickly, sorry, not taking time, but I will be leaving soon. Concrete questions, if like it's possible to have engagement between Russian and Ukrainian exiles. It's already happening. It's a lot, actually. My organization, again, as I said, we still have an office in Kiev and Lviv, and with the Ukrainian government together, we have a program on, and the Ukrainian human rights defenders, a program on helping Ukrainian hostages of the Kremlin regime held in Russian jails. It's impossible to do it without Russian lawyers, those who will be, again, doing in-country litigation or going to prisons and so on. Since full-scale invasion, we have a big project, Poshuk Polon, searching for prisoners of war. We know prison system, unfortunately, too well in Russia, and we know how loopholes, how we can identify where all these prisoners of war are being held. Otherwise, for Ukrainian states, they're missing. They cannot even start the procedure of prisoner swap before that. And many other initiatives. Russian lawyers, activists contribute a lot to evidence-based, to this whatever international tribunal or special tribunal. Again, all this so interconnected. This is what is happening in Ukraine now. It all stems from all the crimes that are inside Russia. And again, we are the ones who can give all this data to the international community. So, or with Stratcom initiative, I think I've never been working more with Ukrainian, different Ukrainian initiatives than now. We do a lot of things together. Again, it's when there are some public forum, maybe there is some, again, all this messaging about it's impossible to work with Russian, but on concrete level, there is a lot of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And before you have to sign off, let me already thank you for joining us today. It was great to have you with us. I want to go back for a second to the question of the democratic opposition, because there's another question from my colleague Sergiu Panainte, which is about the traction that some of the older representatives and faces of the democratic opposition of Russia have, names like Kasparov. Oksana, what's your sense there? Are they still playing a sort of major role in all of this, or should we much more looking at new actors and perhaps also to identify those from among, especially those who have left more recently? What's your sense, Oksana?
Thank you. Yes, there's prominent oppositional figures, as I call them. Of course, they are well known for almost everyone. They still play a very important role. They are a moral orientation for many, but I would say there is also a question of generational gap when we speak about the new immigrants of 2022, because as mentioned, they are predominantly young and probably have not experienced these figures as they were still in Russia. So we see also new personalities who emerge. Probably that is at the moment that would be a very close, a very small circle of researchers who would see them. But there are new persons, new strong personalities who show a strong degree of civic responsibility, who invest their own resources, even sometimes financial ones, to develop the projects. that are the variety of projects is very vast, from shelters to help the immigrants in the initial stage of immigration till the beginnings of some kind of political education of them. And there are definitely new persons who are there. I had a great chance, and would also say even privileged, to have conducted a couple of interviews with them, but because of reasons I don't want to put them in some kind of jeopardy. That is why, of course, I would not mention any name, but I know that there are journalists, there are activists, there are people who work on a daily basis to consolidate this migrant society, and who also start new projects. But nevertheless, back to your question, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Garry Kasparov, and the like, they of course play a very important role when we speak, for example, of the about the necessity to reconsider the situation in which Russia is, reconsider also its past and also a vision for the future. But they are also being joined by a vast majority of the Russian civil society that is mostly entirely is now abroad. Their public appearances, mostly due to digital channels too, for example, due to YouTube channels, are still important, and it should also be in the view of supporters. I think at least we should consider both. We should consider both generations too.
Thanks a lot. As we're slowly sort of coming to the last part of this conversation, let's shift to the future a little bit. There's a question from Alexei Gusev about whether there are any sort of exercise of foresight, scenario planning, to get a bit of a sense of what the possible trajectories for Russia's development, especially, are going forward. I certainly know of some of these here on the European side, but Matt, on the US side, especially, sort of what are the exercises that you are aware of? Have you seen any of those? I'm sure that there are quite a few of those scenario planning exercises going on, Matt.
Well, yeah, that's both like that's a hard question to answer in a serious way in this format. So of course, yes, there are loads of people trying to play out serious scenarios for Russia's long-term development. The problem is, just how many unknowns there are, and how the questions can often boil down to somewhat oversimplified binaries, right? Putin lives or Putin dies. Okay, well, does that necessarily determine everything, right? And the obvious answer is no, of course it doesn't determine everything. There are people other than Putin, but it is a highly personalized system. So, that's just an example of the kind of analytical spin cycles that we get into. The other problem is, we're in the middle of what is, very clearly a proxy war between the entire democratic West and Russia and a very tiny handful of quasi-allies. In that scenario, it is really hard to think through anything other than our own victory, because we have a stake in it. It matters to us. We are heavily committed to it. So there is something politically problematic and even maybe intellectually difficult about gaming out a scenario in which it's anything other than our victory. The problem is, of course, we might have to deal with something that falls in between victory and failure, or something that takes longer than we hope it would take. And those scenarios, again, there's a whole host of reasons why those are difficult. So Joerg, if I can just take a minute or two, I wanted to comment on some things that Natasha said. I think that Paris meeting that she mentioned, the idea of, kind of very high visibility leaders of the Russian exile community jointly meeting with Western officials is really important. I would love to see more of that, less in the kind of official meeting setting and more in the communicating to their own constituents setting, because unfortunately in that setting, there is a lot of internal sort of sniping and discrediting of one another. And actually, there was a question, I'm sure Oksana can address this much better than I can. I'll just say a limited amount about it. This question about kind of imperialist narratives within the Russian democratic opposition. And that is often one of the cudgels, one of the weapons that, one part of the community uses against the other part. Says, oh, you guys are just old thinking imperialists. And it reminds me very much of the kind of debates that we have within Western societies. That you are just doing identity politics, or you are bigoted and not open-minded, et cetera. And the reality is, it's a process, right? I mean, every democratic society, whether it's in exile or it's living in its home, has this kind of pluralism and this kind of debate within it. The question is, does that inhibit productive problem solving? And to be very frank about it, the historical track record is not good up to now. For Russians in exile, that more often the internal fighting and the internal cleavages has inhibited effectiveness, has made them less effective. I am hopeful that is not the case this time around. And the last point that I just wanted to comment on is on the question about Russian and Ukrainian democratic cooperation. And I just think I want to fully echo what Natasha said, which is some of the things that Ukraine must achieve, like accountability for Russian war crimes, will only be possible with cooperation with like-minded Russians. And therefore, building the foundation for that today and not trying to do it at the same time that there are probably going to be 100 other urgent priorities in some future version of Russia, it would be very smart.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I want to go back one last time to Oksana on exactly the question that Matt just mentioned, and that is the internal discourse within, whether it's Russian society or also only the diaspora community of Russians. Oksana, also in your presentation, in your paper, you make this point sort of very central to this democratic potential of the Russian diaspora. That sort of values a critical discourse, also a shedding of some of those sort of ideological pillars that we see so strongly, including the Russian imperialism. Basically, these are things that need to be addressed. I mean, if you were to take the temperature of the sort of discourse also within the Russian diaspora, do you see this coming to the fore more systematically, this questioning of some of those sort of traditional obstacles to a more democratic development of Russia? Because it seems that sort of internal discourse is something that would probably be a first step towards a more positive development, and perhaps also a stronger role from within the diaspora. What can you sort of tell us about that?
Thank you. Yes, I do see the beginnings of this discourse. And I also see that it is not so old, so it just starts. I also see that these public intellectuals that are largely abroad now are probably the agents who have started it and who transfer it also inside the country. I also see these new younger actors who are, for example, journalists are doing it, as I also said already, on a daily basis. I'm really impressed when I see which agenda they are consistently working through. You can see that they are really very really serious with the things, because doing that, I know which so-called planning horizon they have, with small funds, with almost no perspective, at best, with the perspective of 1 month planning. So it convinces me that these beginnings can, the sprouts can also develop if they are being supported. I agree that this process is very of reconsidering the process of an internal debate that ideally should cover also the people inside Russia is first a very necessary one, and second, probably a very painful one. I also agree that maybe it comes too late, but it is the stand that we have. It is good that it has started. And in this sense, of course, Ukraine has now a priority, and victory of Ukraine has a priority. But at some point, Russia will have to be focused on itself, because speaking with Jan Rojansky, one of the founders of Memorial, this madness, one of the first victims of this madness that we are experiencing now was the historical memory of Russia itself. And we have to deal with it at some point. So to continue with Rojansky, in order to present the aggression against a neighboring country as a struggle against fascism, they distorted the minds of Russian citizens. The Russian mass media refers to the armed invasion, annexation, terror, and war crimes of a neighboring country as anti-fascism. The term fascism, on the other hand, refers to resistance to an aggressor. So we have, to some point, we have to correct also these things, and that is a very Russian thing. Russia has to ask itself the questions how it came to this. Only this could be then a basis for its social and political rebirth. And maybe if I may make one maybe concluding remark now, or do we have?
Go ahead.
So as Matt said, there are many variables that are not known. We don't know how the war ends. We don't know how it lasts, how long it lasts. But speaking about the support for the democratic efforts of the people from Russia, outside Russia and inside Russia, I think it is often a question also of trust. It is a question of belief, of whether we believe in general in this option for Russia of a democratic future. And it is often, therefore, it is often the question of support of democratic efforts is not only a question of problem solving, but a question of trust, also of trust to the people who show these democratic sprouts. And it is also a question of trust in individuals and a question of trust in the future of the country that is at the moment an aggressor. But we need
Thank you
trust.
so much. I think this was a sort of perfect sort of ending remark, as it were. I mean, we certainly are not going to give up on sort of the hope that there may be a better Russia one day. I think it's also encouraging to see from this conversation that there are those who engage in this direction, who keep this hope alive, and who in many ways also keep some sort of dignity alive. that there is another Russia. So for all these reasons, rest assured that sort of we will certainly not give up on Russia, and organizations like MATS or like the German Marshall Fund will certainly also engage to support those in the Russian diaspora that would like to see a better Russia to emerge. Many thanks to you again for the paper, for the presentation today. Many thanks, Matt, for joining us here in absentia. Also, many thanks to Natalia again. I think this was a very nuanced discussion. This wasn't necessarily one that was sort of naively optimistic. I think we had plenty of aspects in here that also make us pause and consider whether there really is that stronger potential. But we certainly agree that there's what to be supported, and that there's what to be also further explored. Now, we on the DMF side, we would like to, over the next couple of months, take a closer look at some of those communities that sort of in a very broad picture, Oksana's paper captured here. We would like to sort of get closer to some of those new homes of the Russian diaspora and their activism. So stay tuned for more of these conversations from our end. We would certainly like to see all of you come back to those conversations. We hope you enjoyed this today, and we will certainly continue this conversation. Many thanks, be well, and till soon, I hope. All the best.